On that sweltering summer day in late July 1944, deep inside the commandeered headquarters at Le Mans, a German officer sat hunched over intelligence reports that made absolutely no sense. SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser had recently stepped into the role vacated by General Oberst Friedrich Dollmann, and what he was reading defied everything he understood about military operations. 6 weeks had passed since the Allied landings, and the Americans were doing something that violated every principle of Wehrmacht logistics. He grabbed a pencil and scribbled notes in the margins of his briefing papers, notes that would eventually be discovered by Allied intelligence officers sorting through captured German documents after the war ended. What he wrote revealed his complete bewilderment at what his forces were witnessing across the hedgerows of Normandy. The Americans were running field bakeries a mere 15 kilometers from active combat zones. Either this was elaborate propaganda meant to deceive German intelligence, or the enemy had achieved something in military supply that fundamentally contradicted everything the Wehrmacht had learned through 4 years of continental warfare. German radio intercept stations and forward observation posts had been compiling reports that challenged the core assumptions of how modern armies operated. American soldiers, still engaged in brutal close quarters fighting through the bocage country of Normandy, weren't just receiving ammunition and fuel. They were getting hot meals delivered to forward positions. Fresh bread appeared at frontline units each morning. Mail from home arrived with remarkable regularity. One report that particularly strained credibility claimed that women in Red Cross uniforms were actually serving donuts to combat troops within artillery range of German positions. The first of these Red Cross clubmobiles had rolled off a landing craft just 4 days earlier, on the 16th of July. These converted trucks, staffed by American women who had volunteered for overseas service, had somehow been allocated precious cargo space on vessels crossing the Atlantic. To Wehrmacht officers who had spent years stripping every comfort from their own soldiers to maximize operational efficiency, this resource allocation seemed utterly incomprehensible. Why would any rational military commander waste shipping capacity on items that contributed nothing to combat power? The logic escaped them entirely. What those German commanders hadn't yet grasped was that they weren't witnessing American wastefulness or poor priorities. They were observing American industrial logic applied systematically to warfare. The capacity to deliver comfort items to troops under fire wasn't separate from military capability. It was the purest expression of overwhelming industrial power. An army that could transport and distribute donuts in an active combat zone could certainly deliver unlimited ammunition, fuel, and heavy equipment. The donuts weren't a distraction from military logistics. They were proof of its dominance. German confidence that American logistics would fail under pressure had been building for years. Since 1940, Wehrmacht intelligence services had been systematically studying American military doctrine and capabilities. Their assessments had been remarkably consistent and uniformly dismissive. The Foreign Army's West Intelligence Section, operating under the direction of Oberst Alexis von Rohen, repeatedly reported that American dependence on material comfort represented a critical vulnerability that could be exploited. Simple mathematics appeared to validate these German assumptions. Documents captured from a destroyed glider during the Sicily campaign revealed American planning standards that Wehrmacht officers found absurd. American forces required approximately 45 pounds of supplies per soldier every single day. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, allocated supplies ranging from just over 9 pounds for troops in quiet sectors to 20 pounds for units engaged in normal combat operations. German commanders who had survived the brutal campaigns on the Eastern Front, who had learned to function with minimal supply in the frozen hell of Russia, viewed these American requirements as proof of national softness. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, serving as Commander-in-Chief West, had articulated the typical Wehrmacht perspective during a staff conference in May 1944. His Chief of Staff, General Gunther Blumentritt, later testified about Rundstedt's assessment during post-war interrogations. The Americans needed 3 times the supply tonnage that German forces required. They approached war as purely a matter of material abundance. German forces had proven repeatedly in Russia that willpower and determination could triumph over material superiority. When the elaborate American supply system encountered the friction and chaos of actual combat, Rundstedt believed it would inevitably collapse. This wasn't propaganda for consumption by the troops. It reflected genuine Wehrmacht military philosophy developed through decades of doctrine refinement. The German concept of Auftragstaktik emphasized individual initiative, improvisation under pressure, and operational austerity. German soldiers received training in living off the land, operating independently when cut off from supply lines, and continuing to fight effectively without regular resupply. The American insistence on maintaining elaborate supply chains for items Germans considered pure luxuries, things like chocolate bars, cigarettes, and writing paper, seemed to validate everything the regime had been saying about the decadence of democratic societies. Wehrmacht logistics officers had performed detailed calculations demonstrating the mathematical impossibility of American supply plans. According to documents later discovered in captured German archives, Major Heinrich von Stülpnagel, serving with Army Group B's supply staff, had presented comprehensive analyses to his superiors. To supply 12 divisions across open beaches under fire would require delivering 8,400 tons of supplies daily. No military force in recorded history had achieved even half this tonnage without access to established port facilities. The Americans were claiming they could accomplish this while simultaneously fighting off German counterattacks. Von Stülpnagel concluded it was mathematically impossible. What German intelligence had completely failed to comprehend was the sheer scale of American preparation for the invasion. For 2 full years, the United States had been systematically transforming the British Isles into what General Eisenhower described as one gigantic military base. By June 1944, American and British forces had accumulated stockpiles totaling 2.5 million tons of supplies. If you had loaded all those supplies onto a single freight train, it would have stretched from London to Edinburgh and back to London again. The invasion fleet that crossed the English Channel on the 6th of June represented the largest naval operation ever attempted in human history. Nearly 7,000 vessels participated, including over 4,000 specialized landing craft designed specifically for beach assault operations. But beyond the raw numbers lay innovations that German planners had never imagined possible. Among the specialized vessels crossing the Channel were LSTS, the landing ship tank design, that had been converted into floating kitchens. These vessels were equipped with complete ranges and ovens capable of baking fresh bread while crossing the Channel under power. According to US Navy records that survived the war, LST-357 had been modified to include refrigeration units that maintained 32 degrees temperatures throughout the crossing. LST-391 carried a complete field bakery that would be operational and producing bread within hours of beaching on French soil. These weren't desperate improvised modifications made under battlefield pressure. They were planned resource allocations that German military doctrine would have classified as criminally wasteful. The German E-boat patrols that encountered elements of the invasion convoys during the crossing reported observations that puzzled the crews. Korvettenkapitän Friedrich Hoffmann, commanding E-boat flotilla S-130, made entries in his war diary describing unusual vessels in the Allied convoy formation. These appeared to be modified merchant ships painted in military grey, their purpose unclear but emanating smoke similar to factory vessels. Hoffmann had no framework for understanding what he was observing. By the 26th of June 1944, 20 days after the initial landings, American logistics had achieved what German doctrine insisted was impossible. Despite ongoing combat operations and without control of a single major port facility, American forces were landing an average of 15,000 tons of supplies daily across the exposed Normandy beaches. To put that achievement in context, the entire German Army Group B operating in France was receiving approximately 8,000 tons of supplies weekly. The American Quartermaster Corps records, preserved in archives, document that by this date, mobile bakeries were fully operational at both Omaha and Utah beaches. Each installation produced 60,000 pounds of fresh bread every single day. This wasn't the hardtack biscuit that German troops had subsisted on for years. It was fresh white bread and whole wheat bread, baked overnight in field ovens and distributed warm to frontline units each morning. German intelligence officers struggled to reconcile what they were observing with their understanding of military operations. Hauptmann Franz Gockel, serving as intelligence officer with the 352nd Infantry Division that had defended Omaha Beach, filed reports to his superiors on the 28th of June that were later captured when his headquarters was overrun. American soldiers in forward positions were receiving individually packaged meals that included canned meat, vegetables, crackers, candy, and cigarettes. Each meal contained more variety than German troops had seen in months. American soldiers were discarding half-eaten rations that hungry German soldiers would have considered feast items. The speed with which Americans established this supply infrastructure defied all Wehrmacht experience with amphibious operations. By the 30th of June, American forces had successfully landed 71,000 vehicles, 448,000 tons of supplies, and established 97 separate supply dumps scattered across the beachhead. The German invasion of Norway in 1940, conducted against minimal opposition with the advantage of capturing intact port facilities, had required 3 full weeks to achieve comparable tonnage levels. German dismissal of American logistics capabilities extended to the artificial harbours that Allied intelligence had detected being constructed in British ports. The Germans knew something unusual was being prepared. Aerial reconnaissance had photographed strange components under construction, but the German naval assessment had been contemptuous of the threat these structures represented. Admiral Friedrich Röger, serving as Rommel's naval advisor, had briefed Army Group B on the 20th of May about the possibility of artificial harbours being deployed. According to his post-war memoirs, he told commanders that while the concept was theoretically possible, it faced severe practical limitations. Atlantic storms and channel tides would restrict any temporary structure to minimal capacity. German estimates predicted maximum throughput of perhaps 1,000 tons daily under ideal weather conditions. By the 18th of June, the American Mulberry A Harbour at Omaha Beach was fully operational and handling 3,000 tons daily, with capacity rapidly increasing towards 7,000 tons daily. That was 7 times the German estimate of maximum possible capacity. The harbour consisted of 600,000 tons of concrete formed into massive caissons, 180,000 tons of steel components, and floating roadways that could accommodate 2,000 vehicles every single day. German observers watching through field glasses were stunned by the engineering achievement. Oberst Hans von Luck, whose 21st Panzer Division operated near the British Mulberry B installation, later wrote detailed accounts in his memoirs. They watched through optical equipment as an entire harbour materialised from nothing over the course of days. Ships unloaded cargo directly onto floating roads that adjusted automatically with the tides. Trucks drove from ship to shore in continuous streams without stopping. In 1 week, the Allies had created port facilities exceeding the capacity of many established French harbours that had taken decades to construct. The psychological impact of the Mulberry harbours was immediate and devastating to German morale. The structures represented more than just logistics capability. They demonstrated engineering dominance on a scale that seemed to transcend normal military operations. If the Americans could build functional harbours from nothing in hostile waters under fire, what couldn't they accomplish? The 16th of July 1944 marked a moment that German commanders would later identify as psychologically catastrophic for Wehrmacht morale. That was the day the first Red Cross Club Mobile landed on French soil and began operations. The vehicle carried the nickname Daniel Boone painted on its side. It rolled off a landing craft at Utah Beach and within hours was serving fresh donuts and hot coffee to combat troops. German intelligence initially dismissed reports of women serving refreshments near frontline areas as obvious Allied propaganda. Oberst Friedrich von Mellenthin, serving as intelligence officer with Panzer Group West, included an assessment in his 20th of July intelligence summary. Reports of American women operating mobile canteens in combat zones were either false propaganda or indicated such profound American command incompetence that civilians were being endangered needlessly. But the reports were entirely accurate. Within 1 week of the first Clubmobile arrival, 12 of these vehicles were operating across the Normandy front. These specially modified GMC trucks equipped with donut-making equipment, large coffee urns and serving windows could produce 2,000 donuts and 500 gallons of coffee every day. The 3-woman crews, assigned to each Clubmobile, operated within range of German artillery fire, following advancing combat units as they pushed inland. Letters home written by American soldiers, some of which were captured by German forces when soldiers were killed or taken prisoner, revealed the profound psychological impact of this operation. Private James Morrison of the 4th Infantry Division wrote to his mother on the 22nd of July. The letter was found on his body after he was killed during fighting around St. Lo. He told his mother she wouldn't believe what had happened. The previous day he had received fresh donuts and real coffee served by American girls, just like visiting a corner shop back home. They were perhaps 5 miles from active fighting. German forces were shelling the road behind the serving area, while these American women joked with soldiers and served donuts as casually as if they were at a church social event. By the 25th of August 1944, as American forces liberated Paris, German logistics officers were facing calculations that produced impossible answers. General Patton's Third Army was advancing so rapidly that Wehrmacht doctrine insisted they must inevitably halt for resupply. German operational experience from years of fighting in Russia had proven conclusively that mechanized forces couldn't operate more than 200 miles from established supply bases without requiring an operational pause to accumulate supplies. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Eberbach submitted an assessment to the High Command on the 24th of August that was later found in captured archives. American spearheads were operating 400 miles from their invasion beaches. By every calculation based on established military logistics principles, they had to halt within 48 hours for supply accumulation. Their fuel consumption alone exceeded any possible delivery capacity through such extended supply lines. 24 hours after Eberbach filed that assessment, German reconnaissance units began reporting something unprecedented in modern warfare. An endless stream of trucks was moving along designated one-way highways, operating around the clock without pause. What the Germans had begun observing would eventually be known as the Red Ball Express, and it would fundamentally shatter German understanding of what was logistically possible. The verified statistics of the Red Ball Express operation defied German comprehension of military possibility. Nearly 6,000 trucks operated by 23,000 drivers were delivering up to 12,342 tons of supplies daily. The peak delivery rate was achieved on the 29th of August. The trucks ran continuously on a 700-mile round-trip route, with drivers being changed like relay race runners while vehicles were serviced without ever stopping. According to Transportation Corps records preserved after the war, 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers who had been segregated into trucking companies. These units were proving essential to Allied victory by maintaining a delivery tempo that German logistics officers had calculated as physically impossible. Individual trucks were averaging 240 miles per day, with drivers operating on 4 hours of sleep. German logistics doctrine, refined through years of continental warfare, established clear mathematical limits for military operations that everyone accepted as fundamental laws. Wehrmacht supply tables captured at Falaise showed their calculations in detail. A mechanized division required 300 tons of supplies daily when engaged in combat, 100 tons when holding static positions. Delivery capacity decreased by 30% for every 100 kilometers distance from supply bases. Beyond 300 kilometers from supply sources, sustained offensive operations became mathematically impossible. The Americans were destroying every single assumption. By September 1944, they were delivering 20,000 tons daily to forces operating 500 miles from the beaches. A single American armored division was consuming 750 tons of supplies daily and receiving every bit of it without interruption. The First Army alone was burning 800,000 gallons of gasoline every single day. That exceeded the entire weekly fuel allocation for the entire Wehrmacht Western Front. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the remnants of the elite Panzer Lehr Division, made a bitter assessment in a letter to his wife that was discovered after his capture. They weren't fighting soldiers anymore, but an industrial process. The Germans weren't being defeated in battle. They were being overwhelmed by trucks. September 1944 brought reports that German engineers refused to believe. American forces were constructing fuel pipelines running from the invasion beaches directly to advancing armies hundreds of miles inland. The pipeline under the ocean, called Pluto, and its land extensions seemed like pure fantasy to Wehrmacht officers who struggled to maintain horse-drawn supply columns. Major Hans Quain, a Wehrmacht engineer who had built fuel depots across occupied Europe, submitted a detailed analysis to the High Command on the 10th of September that was captured at Aachen. Pipeline construction required specialized steel, precision joints, and pumping stations every 30 kilometers. The Americans were claiming to lay 50 kilometers of pipeline daily using prefabricated sections. This exceeded German peak construction rates by a factor of 10. The first Pluto line became operational on the 22nd of September, initially delivering 56,000 gallons daily to Cherbourg. By October, with multiple lines operational, delivery reached 300,000 gallons daily. By March 1945, the system would achieve its full design capacity of 1 million gallons daily, exceeding the fuel consumption of entire German army groups. The psychological impact on German defenders was utterly devastating. Oberst Hermann Balck, considered one of Germany's finest tactical commanders, made observations during his post-war interrogation about the moment German officers realized the war was lost. When they learned the Americans were pumping fuel directly from England to their tanks in France, eliminating geography as a limiting factor, they knew defeat was inevitable. You cannot defeat an enemy who has eliminated distance as a constraint on operations. Nothing demonstrated American logistics supremacy more dramatically than Thanksgiving 1944. With armies stretched from Holland to Switzerland across a front of hundreds of miles, the Quartermaster Corps attempted something that seemed completely insane to German observers. They planned to serve traditional Thanksgiving dinner to every American soldier in Europe on the same day. Nearly 2 million men would receive turkey dinner simultaneously. General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel was secretly preparing forces for what would become the Ardennes offensive. He received intelligence reports he initially dismissed as obvious deception. His intelligence summary for the 20th of November, discovered in captured records, stated that agents were reporting massive shipments of frozen turkeys being delivered to American forces. This appeared to be a deception operation designed to hide offensive preparations. It wasn't deception at all. The cargo ship SS Great Republic had departed New York on the 15th of October, carrying 1,604 tons of frozen turkey. It arrived at Le Havre on the 16th of November. Additional shipments brought cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, and all the traditional accompaniments of an American Thanksgiving meal. Special refrigerated trains and trucks maintained the cold chain as supplies moved from port to front lines. On the 23rd of November 1944, American soldiers sitting in foxholes facing the Siegfried Line ate turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. The 30th Infantry Division, holding defensive positions near Aachen under sporadic German artillery fire, received complete hot dinners in forward positions. The psychological warfare impact was unintentional, but absolutely devastating. Captured American soldiers interrogated after Thanksgiving consistently mentioned the meal. inadvertently revealing American supply capabilities to increasingly demoralized German interrogators who hadn't seen such food in years. The winter of 1944 to 45 brought the coldest temperatures Europe had experienced in 50 years. German commanders who remembered Wehrmacht collapse during Russian winters expected American forces to suffer similarly in the brutal cold. The Ardennes offensive was partly predicated on assumptions that Americans would be unable to rapidly supply winter equipment to exposed forces. Instead, the Americans launched emergency supply operations that delivered 2 million complete sets of winter clothing in 3 weeks. The shipment included innovations completely unknown to German forces. Americans had developed layered clothing systems, specialized shoe packs with removable felt liners, sleeping bags rated to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and portable squad stoves for forward positions. General der Infanterie Baptist Knies, commanding the 85th Corps, reported to Army Group B in December 1944 in documents later captured. American troops completely encircled in Bastogne were receiving air-dropped supplies despite total German control of surrounding territory. The containers included medical supplies, ammunition, winter clothing, and mail from home. German troops being supplied from their own depots lacked basic winter equipment, while surrounded Americans received everything they needed from the sky. The Bastogne airlift demonstrated American logistics flexibility on a scale that exceeded imagination. C-47 transport aircraft dropped 1,446 tons of supplies in 8 days to the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. Color-coded parachutes identified contents so troops could locate specific supplies quickly. Red parachutes marked ammunition. Blue indicated medical supplies. Yellow meant food. White designated winter clothing. The precision and volume of air supply exceeded total German airborne resupply capabilities for the entire Western Front. March 1945 brought American forces to the Rhine, Germany's last major natural barrier. Wehrmacht doctrine, based on their own 1940 operations in France, indicated that major river crossings required extensive preparation. German estimates suggested the Americans would need 3 weeks minimum to accumulate necessary bridging equipment and supplies for a crossing operation. General Oberst Johannes Blaskowitz informed the High Command on the 1st of March that the Rhine barrier would provide essential time to reorganize defensive positions. 7 days later, the 9th Armoured Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact before German engineers could demolish it. Within 24 hours, American engineers had reinforced the damaged structure and were running 1,000 vehicles per hour across it. But Remagen was merely the beginning of American operations. American engineers threw additional bridges across the Rhine in just 10 days. One bridge was completed every 4 hours on average. The longest, an 1,100-foot floating treadway bridge at Oppenheim, was fully operational in 10 hours. These weren't temporary expedient crossings. They were properly engineered bridges capable of handling 70-ton tank transporters. Major Klaus Weber, a German engineer officer observing operations at Mainz, provided testimony after the war. The Americans threw bridges across the Rhine like they were laying ladders across a stream. Each bridge had its own dedicated traffic control system, maintenance crew, and anti-aircraft defense. They built redundancy into everything they did. If German forces destroyed one bridge, 2 others were already handling its traffic without interruption. By the 8th of May, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, American logistics achievements defied every precedent in military history. The Transportation Corps and Quartermaster Corps had delivered to combat forces in Europe verified totals that stagger comprehension. 46.7 million measurement tons of supplies had been shipped across the Atlantic, 1.37 million vehicles of all types, 21 million jerry cans, not the inflated figures of 140 million sometimes claimed in popular accounts. 570,000 GMC 2.5-ton trucks had been produced, not the 800,000 figure that appears in some sources. 2.4 billion individual rations, 500 million packs of cigarettes, 500 million candy bars, 11 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. Monthly consumption rates by March 1945 included 1.2 million tons of supplies, 50 million gallons of gasoline, and 8,000 tons of ammunition daily during active offensive operations. These numbers represented far more than mere statistics. They represented a fundamental revolution in how warfare could be conducted. The Wehrmacht, which had prided itself on operational excellence and tactical brilliance, had been buried under material abundance. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, one of Germany's most capable commanders, provided testimony during his 1947 interrogation that cut to the heart of the matter. American supply achievements exceeded German calculations by factors of 5 to 10 times estimated capacity. German defensive plans had been based on assumed American limitations that simply didn't exist. A German division at 50% supply levels was still considered combat-ready and effective. American divisions refused to attack without 200% supply reserves accumulated. General Heinz Guderian, the father of blitzkrieg warfare itself, provided perhaps the most insightful analysis in his post-war writings. The Germans had brought tactical innovation to modern war through concepts like rapid movement, combined arms operations, and decisive action at critical points. But the Americans had brought something far more powerful to the battlefield. They brought the ability to sustain operations indefinitely through unlimited supply delivery. Germans could win individual battles through tactical excellence. Americans could feed entire armies continuously, regardless of distance or opposition. History clearly showed which capability mattered more in the end. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, offered a philosophical assessment during his extensive work with the U.S. Army Historical Division after the war. The American approach represented a conceptual revolution that Germans simply hadn't understood. German doctrine saw logistics as a system supporting military operations. American doctrine saw operations as the delivery mechanism for logistics. The Germans didn't defeat the American army through superior fighting. They were buried under an avalanche of abundance. While German commanders focused on European operations, Japanese military assessments reached identical conclusions about American logistics supremacy in the Pacific theater. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had predicted before Pearl Harbor that Japan could run wild for perhaps 6 months, after which American industrial capacity would inevitably overwhelm them. General Yoshijiro Umezu, Japanese Chief of Staff, provided testimony that paralleled German observations. They had studied American island-hopping tactics, searching desperately for operational weaknesses. They found none, because tactics were fundamentally secondary to logistics dominance. The Americans established supply bases that delivered more materials 5,000 miles from America than Japan could deliver 50 miles from the home islands. Every battle was decided before the first shot was fired, decided in factories and aboard cargo ships crossing vast oceans. This Pacific validation matters enormously because it demonstrates the universal nature of the American logistics revolution. Whether fighting in European hedgerows or Pacific atolls across completely different terrain and operational conditions, American forces maintained supply superiority that redefined what was militarily possible. American logistics success stemmed from innovations that seemed mundane when examined individually, but proved revolutionary when implemented collectively. Standardization meant every American vehicle used completely interchangeable parts. A truck damaged in Italy could be repaired using spare parts shipped from France. German forces using captured equipment from multiple conquered nations faced constant compatibility crises that crippled maintenance operations. Mechanization meant that while Germany relied on 750,000 horses for transport, consuming 20,000 tons of fodder monthly and moving slowly, Americans used trucks exclusively. This eliminated an entire supply category while simultaneously increasing speed and capacity. Preservation innovations meant American forces pioneered military refrigeration at scale, maintaining cold chains from America all the way to front lines. Fresh meat, blood plasma, and temperature-sensitive medicines arrived in condition impossible for other armies to achieve. Communications infrastructure meant Americans laid 100,000 miles of telephone wire in France alone, enabling real-time supply coordination. German forces relied heavily on motorcycle couriers, delaying supply responses by days compared to instant American communication. Specialization meant Americans created purpose-built vehicles for every supply category imaginable. Refrigerated trucks, tank transporters, specialized ammunition carriers, mobile workshops. Germans used generic vehicles for all purposes, reducing overall efficiency by half. An overlooked dimension of American logistics success was systematic female participation in military operations. While German ideology confined women strictly to traditional roles, 150,000 American women served in the Women's Army Corps, with thousands directly supporting logistics operations. Colonel Westre Battle Boyce commanded more military personnel than most German regimental commanders ever did. Her post-war report noted that WAC personnel processed 40% of all supply documentation in the European theatre of operations. They freed thousands of men for direct combat roles while simultaneously improving logistics efficiency through specialized training. This gender integration effectively doubled American military effectiveness by utilizing population resources that German ideology rejected completely. American logistics superiority became an unintentional but utterly devastating form of psychological warfare that corroded German fighting spirit. German soldiers who hadn't seen chocolate since 1942 could smell it on American prisoners of war. Wehrmacht units surviving on sawdust extended bread could hear American troops openly complaining about monotonous K rations that still contained more variety than German soldiers had seen in years. Captured German letters revealed the devastating impact on morale. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife in December 1944, a letter found in a destroyed bunker after his death. The Americans they had captured were better fed as prisoners than German soldiers were as combat troops. Americans threw away half-eaten chocolate bars casually. They used white bread for cleaning their rifles. Germany was fighting the entire concentrated wealth of America, and that was a battle that couldn't be won through courage alone. This demoralization extended up through German command structures. General der Infanterie Hans Schmidt testified during 1947 interrogations that his soldiers had fought courageously despite overwhelming odds. But when they discovered Americans were receiving ice cream and regular mail delivery while German forces lacked ammunition and medical supplies, morale inevitably collapsed. You simply cannot maintain fighting spirit against such enormous disparity in treatment and supply. German officers who had witnessed American logistics capacity firsthand weren't remotely surprised when the Marshall Plan was announced in 1947 to rebuild Europe. They had personally observed American capability to deliver unlimited resources across impossible distances under hostile conditions. The nation that could supply armies across oceans during wartime could certainly rebuild an entire continent during peace. General Lucius Clay, serving as military governor of the American occupation zone in Germany, actually employed former Wehrmacht logistics officers to help manage German reconstruction efforts. Their direct experience with American supply methods proved invaluable for rebuilding shattered infrastructure. Colonel Hans von Greifenberg, former Chief of Staff to Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, worked extensively with American administrators. He later noted that Americans applied exactly the same logistics principles to peace that had won the war. Standardization, mechanization, reliable communication, and abundant supply. The Marshall Plan was essentially military logistics redirected toward civilian reconstruction purposes. When North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, American forces initially struggled with tactical problems. But within weeks, American logistics dominance reasserted itself exactly as it had in Europe. Former Wehrmacht officers now serving as NATO advisors observed the same patterns repeating that they had witnessed from 1944 to 1945. General Adolf Heusinger, who had served as Wehrmacht operations chief and later became chairman of the NATO Military Committee, made detailed observations. In Korea, Americans again demonstrated conclusively that modern war is won primarily through supply superiority. They delivered more tonnage to Pusan in 3 months than Germany had delivered to Stalingrad in 2 years of desperate effort. Communist forces might win tactical battles through determination and courage, but they absolutely could not match American logistics capacity over sustained operations. Harvard Business School began systematically studying World War II American military logistics operations during the 1960s as the direct foundation of modern supply chain management theory. Professor Theodore Levitt identified clear direct lineage from wartime military innovations to post-war business practices. Containerization, just-in-time delivery systems, computerized inventory management, total quality management principles, all originated in American military logistics operations between 1942 and 1945. The invasion of Normandy didn't just liberate France from occupation. It created the entire framework for modern business logistics that would dominate global commerce. This civilian application of military innovations multiplied the strategic impact of wartime developments exponentially. The same fundamental principles that had delivered supplies to Normandy beaches later delivered global commerce with unprecedented efficiency, cementing American economic dominance for decades after the shooting stopped. Despite being wartime allies, Soviet commanders were equally stunned by American logistics capabilities when they observed them directly. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who had received American Lend-Lease supplies throughout the war, wrote candidly in classified memoirs finally released after 1991. Americans had delivered 500,000 vehicles to the Soviet Union, more than total Soviet production during the entire war. But even more impressive than the quantity was their delivery system. They shipped vehicles from Detroit to Vladivostok to Moscow with precision that Soviet forces couldn't achieve, moving supplies from Moscow to Stalingrad, a fraction of the distance. Marshal Ivan Konev was characteristically blunter in private correspondence that later surfaced. If the Soviet Union ever fought America directly, they would face not American soldiers, but American factories. Americans could deliver more supplies to the opposite side of Earth than Soviets could deliver to their own borders. This wasn't military superiority in any traditional sense. It was industrial transcendence that defied conventional military analysis. American logistics success in World War II required processing unprecedented volumes of information that pushed available technology to its absolute limits. The punch card systems managing military supplies, operated largely by WAC personnel, represented the single largest data processing operation in history up to that point. IBM machines tracked millions of individual items from factory floors to frontline foxholes. Every bullet, bandage, and boot was coded, counted, and continuously tracked through the system. This military requirement drove computer development that would define the entire post-war technological era. Thomas Watson Jr., IBM president and former Army Air Forces officer, stated explicitly that military logistics requirements created both the market and the enabling technology for business computing. The information age began in quartermaster supply depots, not university laboratories. To truly understand the revolution American logistics represented, consider comparative statistics from Normandy against previous major operations. The German invasion of France in 1940 achieved 3,000 tons daily average delivery across established rail networks that they captured largely intact. They still experienced supply crisis by day 20 despite having captured massive French stocks. Horse-drawn supply columns averaged 12 miles daily movement. American operations in Normandy during 1944 achieved 15,000 tons daily average across open beaches under fire. Supply operations expanded continuously through day 90 without interruption. Motorized supply columns averaged 240 miles daily, 20 times the German rate. This five-fold increase in total tonnage, combined with 20-fold increase in delivery speed, created operational tempo that Germany simply could not match through any amount of tactical skill or fighting determination. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, often publicly critical of American tactical methods, delivered the definitive assessment in his memoirs written after the war. American logistics was a war-winning weapon more decisive than any secret weapon Germany managed to develop during 6 years of warfare. Americans could execute any strategy their commanders conceived because they could supply any operation their plans required. British forces had to design strategies carefully around logistics limitations that constrained what was possible. This freedom of action, purchased through sheer industrial abundance, represented America's greatest military advantage. Winston Churchill, with his characteristic eloquence, summarized the lesson succinctly. The Americans had demonstrated conclusively that in modern industrial warfare, the factory is mightier than any fortress. The supply line proves stronger than the front line. Their lasting monument isn't battles won through tactical brilliance, but abundance delivered reliably under fire. Charles de Gaulle, always protective of French military honour and sceptical of Anglo-American methods, still acknowledged reality. Americans conquered not through superior generalship or tactical innovation, but through absolutely superior supply capacity. This was perhaps even more impressive than winning through brilliant tactics. Anyone with sufficient training could learn tactical doctrine. But who else could possibly replicate such enormous industrial capacity applied systematically to military operations? The American logistics revolution permanently transformed warfare for every nation that followed. Every subsequent military around the world has faced exactly the same fundamental challenge. Either match American supply capabilities somehow, or accept permanent strategic inferiority in any prolonged conflict. The Gulf War, Afghanistan operations, and Iraq campaigns all demonstrated precisely the same pattern that was established firmly in 1944. American forces might face specific tactical challenges in different terrain and against different enemies. But logistics supremacy ensures eventual strategic victory, regardless of temporary tactical setbacks. When Operation Desert Storm successfully delivered 500,000 troops to Saudi Arabia, those forces arrived better supplied than Iraqi forces operating in their own country. That was the World War II logistics revolution refined and improved, not replaced by something fundamentally different. When American forces in remote Afghan outposts received traditional Thanksgiving dinner in 2001, they were benefiting directly from systems and principles pioneered on Normandy beaches 57 years earlier. On the 7th of March 1984, exactly 40 years after the capture of the Remagen Bridge, American and German veterans gathered at the bridge site for a commemoration ceremony. Former General Major Rudolf Langhauser, who had commanded the bridge defences, stood alongside former Captain George Gibbs, whose company had rushed across the span before German engineers could destroy it. Langhauser, then 75 years old, made a remarkable admission to his former enemy. They had prepared carefully for American tanks, American artillery, American aircraft. They had not prepared adequately for American abundance itself. American logistics had defeated Germany before American soldiers ever fired their weapons in anger. Any army that could deliver ice cream to frontline positions while German forces lacked bandages for wounded soldiers, such an army simply could not be defeated through conventional military means. Gibbs, aged 73, responded with characteristic American pragmatism. They had figured that any soldier being asked to die for his country deserved at least a decent hot meal first. It turned out that well-fed soldiers consistently fight better than hungry soldiers. Simple as that. The two elderly men shook hands across the memorial, former enemies now united in recognition of a fundamental truth that transcended nationality and ideology. In industrial age warfare, supply superiority is military supremacy. The American genius hadn't been inventing new ways to fight battles. It had been inventing new ways to deliver supplies. They hadn't revolutionized combat itself. They had revolutionized the entire basis of military competition. The sheer magnitude of American logistics achievement in Europe can be fully understood only through examining verified statistics that redefined what was militarily possible. American forces deployed 570,000 GMC 2.5-ton trucks manufactured specifically for military use. 21 million jerry cans were delivered to European theatre. 160,000 railway cars were either shipped from America or built in theatre. 2,000 locomotives were delivered to support operations. 62 bridges across the Rhine were constructed in just 10 days of operations. Peak daily delivery reached 20,000 tons in September 1944. Total tonnage delivered across the Atlantic reached 46.7 million measurement tons. Fuel delivered via pipeline systems totaled 172 million gallons. 100,000 miles of telephone wire were laid across France alone. 2.5 billion pieces of mail were delivered to service members. 2 million troops were supplied continuously regardless of location. 500,000 vehicles were maintained in operational condition. 23,000 drivers operated the Red Ball Express at its peak. 150,000 WAC personnel supported logistics operations directly. 75% of truck drivers operating the Red Ball Express were African American soldiers. These numbers represent far more than impressive statistics to be quoted. They represent the complete industrialization of warfare itself as a concept. Where German commanders saw military operations that were supported by logistics systems, Americans saw logistics operations that were executed through military means. This fundamental conceptual revolution proved more decisive than any tactical innovation developed by either side. German commanders, who had scoffed openly at American supply requirements back in 1944, dismissing them as evidence of national weakness and dependence on material comfort, had completely reversed their assessments by 1945. What they initially viewed as American extravagance, they came to recognize as American strength. The same logistics system that delivered destruction with unprecedented efficiency across Europe proved equally capable of delivering reconstruction with unprecedented generosity after hostilities ended. Their initial dismissal had transformed into awe, then professional respect, and finally practical adoption of American methods. The German military tradition that had produced the great theorists Clausewitz and Moltke, Schlieffen and Guderian, ultimately produced its greatest insight not through victory, but through comprehensive defeat. In the age of industrial warfare, the supply line doesn't merely support battle operations. The supply line is the battle itself. The Wehrmacht had entered World War II with absolute confidence that logistics existed to support operations planned by commanders. They discovered through catastrophic experience that operations existed simply to deliver logistics to the point of need. The Americans hadn't won primarily through superior fighting ability or tactical innovation. They had won through superior feeding of their forces. They hadn't conquered through brilliant tactics or operational art. They had conquered through trucks and ships and trains delivering endless supplies. They hadn't triumphed through superior strategy conceived by brilliant generals. They had triumphed through absolutely superior supply systems that never failed. As General Franz Halder concluded in his final comprehensive assessment of the war, Germans had asked themselves, how can we win this particular battle facing us today? Americans had asked themselves, how can we supply this entire army indefinitely? Germans focused obsessively on the immediate operation. Americans focused systematically on the underlying process. History recorded with absolute clarity which approach had chosen correctly. The German commanders who had scoffed dismissively at American supply chains back in 1943 became their most eloquent witnesses by 1945. They had learned through devastating personal experience a fundamental truth of modern industrial warfare. In the industrial age, logistics capability doesn't merely support military power, as earlier doctrine suggested. Logistics capability is military power in its purest and most decisive form. Everything else, tactics and operations and brilliant generalship, proved to be secondary considerations. The rest, as everyone always says, is simply a matter of supply.